Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Destination Truth. This one is going to be a doozy because this is going to be absolutely the most in-depth and elaborate book review I have done ever to date. And the reason why is important because I've been talking about this for a while, and I'm about to finally film this Kickstarter campaign. I've got a video planned, written the script and everything, but I wanted to do background research in advance so that when this thing hits the ground, if I'm successful with the Kickstarter campaign, I can hit the ground running. That's what I want to be able to do. So the book is American Psychosis: How the Federal Government Destroyed the Mental Illness Treatment System. That is a mouthful. It is by Torrey Fuller, and well, to be blunt, it's a great book, and we're about to get into it. But first things first, I want to talk a little bit about this cool software I am using. And let me show you here. All right, so this is called eDraw Mastermind. Now, I am not endorsed, affiliated, or sponsored, or anything like that by these guys, but I will say I did a lot of research into good brainstorming software and basically like timeline making software, and this is actually the best stuff I could find that is free, and they have a premium version that's even better. So, and they have a paid version that's even better. So that all said, let's go ahead and jump into this. As you can see, I have a lot of notes, so I'm going to skim some of this stuff and not really go into all of it because I know that I could talk for over an hour on this book easily. I've read the book 2.5 times, more times than I've read any book in my life. That is not an exaggeration. I've never read the Bible more than once. I've never read Harry Potter series more than once. I'm not a particularly fast reader. I'm not a slow reader either. I'm like right in the middle, I would say. But still, reading this book 2.5 times in order to make the most important notes for you guys to be able to understand what is important about this book and what's most important about the history of the mental illness treatment system in America. And so we're going to go ahead and get right into it, and I'll keep me right here in the corner to keep you guys company. Okay, so let's jump into it. All right, here we are. So, American Psychosis. So, this goes way back to the very early days of the country, and when I say that, I mean like we're going to talk about a historical look about how the United States has dealt with the insane, mentally ill people, and what it's doing all the way up to this present day, and why is very important because, as I've mentioned, the documentary film I want to make called Hopeless San Francisco is not just about how bad it is in SF. There's already been a bunch of documentaries coming out talking about, oh, it's so bad in San Francisco. It's so bad. It's not an exaggeration. Look at this. Look at that. And there's actually good work coming out of other cities like ours, like Seattle is Dying. That one was actually made by a mainstream news outlet in Seattle. So, as you can see, I've got a lot of information here. I might want to gloss over some of it, but some of it's really important. So basically, in the very beginning of the country, Dorothea Dix was the first person in the 1860s, basically, to start helping Franklin Pierce get something built for the country to start addressing the fact that we have lots of people that are insane, because every country has a certain number of people that are just, their head was not developed properly for who knows what reason. There's too many to list under the sun. But Dorothea Dix, with the facilitation of the sale of, I'm going to zoom in so you guys can actually read this. I was noticing you guys, that was too small. With the sale of federal lands, was able to actually finance the construction of many of the first state mental hospitals around the country. So Dorothea Dix did a really good job because she was also doing some of the very earliest reporting on how bad it was in the early days. And in the early days, mentally ill people were either A, neglected by their families, B, sent to poorhouses where they were just mixed in with a bunch of poor people that weren't necessarily insane. So they were obviously neglected a lot, abused, beaten, killed sometimes, but a number of other institutions that kind of weren't necessarily charged with taking care of insane people. Okay, fast forward almost 100 years. Robert Felix starts planning the creation of the CMHC system, Community Mental Health center or clinic system. This planning starts in the early 1940s and is developed throughout the years. And what really helps get the federal government behind Robert Felix, was in World War II, and we had the draft. The largest number of men that they could not get from the draft was due to mental illness. So to be even more accurate, it was also mental retardation. And we're going to get into some of the early American presidents and why they were interested in mental retardation in a second. But basically, 18% of men were rejected due to mental illness that were drafted. 12% were rejected due to mental retardation, IQ under 80. I think it's like 75 technically is you're retarded, or maybe it's 70, but somewhere below 80. And then 5% due to neurological diseases. And that means as a total, 38% were discharged from the draft due to mental disease. So that means, we should really research this and see if we can prevent this, because in the case of war and other, also just the labor force, we're talking about a third of men not being able to work or function in society. So that's a big deal. So that's how we really got the numbers to say, hey, this is worth researching. Okay. So Sigmund Freud, one of the most famous psychologists to this day at the time, believed in something called mental hygiene. Mental hygiene is basically a fantasy now, which led many other people to follow this, tunnel, this hole, like a rabbit hole, and create a whole number of things that are basically completely fictitious, which is really terrible, because to this day, the CMHC system does exist. It's in a lesser form, but basically all of mental illness treatment in this country today is more of mental health treatment, not mental illness treatment. There is a difference, and I think I'll elaborate on that a little bit later on. To quote Robert Felix and how he believed in this mental hygiene thing, Felix once said, "As a tree is bent, so it grows, and we like to do what we can, while the youth is, figuratively speaking, a sapling." So he believed that if you take care of people when they're young, you can basically prevent mental illness. A grand jury the same year, 1945, indicted a state hospital with terrible conditions for their patients, and this came out of World War II conscientious objectors to the war, which were, asked to do other things for the country, basically for free. And so that's one of the very earliest exposés. The very next year, 46, the Times Magazine published a very scathing exposé called Bedlam. Most mental hospitals are a shame and a disgrace. Using Bosch-style photographs of overfilled rooms of dirty, naked patients, they basically talked about how very many mental hospitals, especially on the East Coast, were just awful, and they're just not taking care of the people that they're charged to take care of. And the people were living in just squalid conditions, really terrible, and many of them were beaten or getting other diseases because of how unclean the facilities were. 2 years later, Robert Felix publishes a psychiatric publication. The content and orientation of personality are powerfully influenced by the social setting. Thus, serious mental illness can be caused by social factors such as, I won't even get into that because there's just way too many things to talk about there. Now, 2 years later, something very important happened. The creation of chlorpromazine, or Thorazine, was invented by French laboratories Rhone Poulenc Company. And that was all of this happening in the 40s and 1950. This was obviously the beginning of the end of mental hospitals as we knew them back then, because mental hospitals had become this scary thing that, once you are charged to be mentally unstable, you are basically put in them against your will. You are basically to be committed to a public institution against your will was a big deal, and it was totally, absolutely neglected many times by wealthy people that, they wanted a new wife, yada yada. I don't have sources in this because this book is talking mostly about history and not anecdotal evidence of the whole entire system being neglected, but we're going to talk about the system as a whole much more. And for now, because of this time, the 1940s to 1950s, such a absolutely core piece of the puzzle, I'm going to start talking about some people that Felix became friends with. Okay, so with the creation of Thorazine, this marked the beginning of a whole new era of mental illness treatment. A Dr. Pierre Denneker publishes papers on basically Thorazine's use. And, when a lot of these, this is a funny story that you guys might not know about, is basically in the early days when the drug industry, big pharma, if you will, was in its early days. Whenever a new any kind of drug for a human was made, they would often try using it on animals and see what would happen, and basically study behavior in like rats or sometimes monkeys, but especially rats, and just guess what they were feeling, and then they would go to human trial. So this guy in France did a study on a total of about 55 patients, and that was about it, honestly. But basically, it said this thing is actually good as a antipsychotic, and he used it on a small sample, but still it proved useful as an antipsychotic. And so then Thorazine was introduced in 54, 4 years after it was first invented, into America. And William Winkelmann publishes his research on a much larger sample size of over 100 people, and showing how it does have remarkable effects in reducing the symptoms of psychotic disorders. Now, I've talked to a number of people about Thorazine and drugs like this, and most people I talk to are like, what are you talking about? How is that a good thing? But in the early days, we didn't have any kind of antipsychotics. It was the first one of its kind. So although it does have a lot of side effects, it's not perfect. It's far from perfect. It did do some great things, and it actually allowed, it was the beginning of what would later become deinstitutionalization, and deinstitutionalization was markedly related to the introduction of antipsychotic drugs, and so this really was the beginning of the deinstitutionalization era in the 1960s. Now, let's talk about the Kennedy family, because they're very important. So they had a member of their family, Mary Ann, who was actually mentally retarded, and they took care of her best they could. And this is a powerful family. They're actually Irish, and because of that, Kennedy Sr., the guy that brought the family to wealth and politics, worked very hard. I mean, there's some quotes in the book about how he was very serious about earning respect from his society and doing whatever it took to be a respectable, upright citizen, and how that really meant something back then. It's something that was earned and not given. And so he really needed to keep his daughter Marianne out of the limelight. And so eventually, when she got a little bit older and harder to take care of, they sent her to a convent, Catholic convent, where she was hidden away. And unfortunately, she started sneaking out later, and she was being promiscuous. She was running out, sneaking out, and being promiscuous with men, and people were worried she was going to get raped, yada yada. She was going to get pregnant, and there's rumors that she did get pregnant, and that there was a covered up abortion. But because of this behavior, the family decided it was a good idea to lobotomize her. And after they lobotomized her, they realized they'd made a terrible decision, because they had effectively killed their sister. She was no longer a person; she was like a vegetable, and they're all very sorrowful about it, because they realized that they had basically killed their sister. So this was a deeply impactful event to the Kennedy family. And when JFK becomes president, he elects his sister Eunice Kennedy, who married someone with the last name Shriver. to help lead national research into mental retardation to attempt to heal a family's wounds over their sister. And then John F. Kennedy expresses great optimism in his special message to Congress on February 5th, 1963, in which he proposed a national mental health program to, and this ties hand in hand with Robert Felix, and I'm about to get back to him. But basically, Trends on Mental Health Programs was published. Whoops, I'm skipping ahead. I'm sorry. To inaugurate a wholly new emphasis and approach to care for the mentally ill and retardation, the mental retardation facilities and mental health centers Construction Act of 1963 basically set aside millions and millions of dollars for taking care of mentally retarded persons as well as the mentally ill. So this also had lobbyist groups, many, in particular Mike Gorman, we're going to talk about when it comes to this era, the 60s in particular, because he plays a big role. Mental illness and mental retardation are among the most critical health problems. They occur more frequently, affect more people, require more prolonged treatment, cause more suffering by families of the afflicted, waste more of our human resources, and constitute more financial drain upon both the public treasury and personal finances of the individual families than any other condition. That is a direct quote from President JFK, message to Congress on the same day, February 5th, 1963. Okay, so during that time, we've got these collaborators with Robert Felix, and all four of these men, not Mike Gorman, who's just a journalist, but all four of these men later became American Psychiatric Association presidents. So these are important men, all four of them. Let's start with Jack Ewald. These are all doctors, of course. He was also Kansas born. So was Robert Felix, by the way. He was trained in psychiatry at the Colorado Psychopathic Hospital with Dr. Franklin Ebow. Next, we've got William Menninger, also from Kansas, and was actually childhood friends with Robert Felix. And he strongly believed that psychiatrists were the most important people in the country and in the world, basically, at the time for creating a better and brighter future for everybody, because this is post World War II now, and he believed that understanding humanity, the human brain, and society at large was basically a charge of such great power that basically meant psychiatrists need to take the power and use it. And lastly, we've got Dr. Francis Braceland. He is from Philadelphia, on the other hand, and he studied under Carl Jung in Europe and believed insanity was a form of it was derived from negative social interactions and relationships that were basically toxic, and they created mental illness. Okay, so these people together are what collaborated to write and pass the bill that JFK passed, which was the National Mental Health Program that I just quoted. Okay, so during the same times, I think it's important, because if you watch Destination Truth, you know that I realize that communists have been in the fray for a long time, and none of this stuff is new. It's just unknown to us because we basically allowed Democrats to cover up the trail of the communists, and a lot of this stuff was able to go under the radar, and to this day we don't know a lot of this information because let's just go back for a second to Senator McCarthy. McCarthy was basically had his reputation destroyed and was thrown under the bus, and no one believed him, even though he was correct about everything, about how communists had infiltrated the U.S. government, the press, the media, entertainment, and most importantly, academia. And he was absolutely right. And he stands correct in his grave. But at the time that he was alive, McCarthy had his reputation just absolutely thrown under the bus. He was forcefully committed against his will, by the way. They're calling him insane to believe that communists were taking over the government. But he is right. So, anyways, I mentioned right here, Mike Gorman was imperative to this whole movement, because Mike Gorman, who is not only a journalist but a very powerful lobbyist for the mental illness treatment lobby. Basically, a little background on him: he was a smart guy. He graduated from like high school cum laude or something, and then he didn't finish his degree because he went to war. But he was discharged in 1945 due to psychotic symptoms, being that he had a lot of anxiety, sudden outbursts and tantrums, and vomiting. And he later became an alcoholic after this time in the war. His actual duty in the war did not say he never left the United States, even though all of this happened. So I personally believe that he was trying to get out of it, and was forcing some of those conditions, because from what I read, his job in the military was like a communications director, and he was based like in like the Midwest. He was at a military base in like Oklahoma. I forget which Air Force base or something, but he did not see like action. So it's kind of strange. But anyways, he became a leading journalist on the mental health front later after this time when he returned. But and his college education was in journalism, by the way, and he got a good job right after the war, surprisingly, even though he didn't have a finished degree in journalism. But he admitted that he was a Communist Party member, but he was also allegedly a communist student group leader for many years. And when he was confronted about this during his military time, he did not deny it. He also took pride later on in becoming a mental health public lobbyist and bragged about doing bribes. One quote from the book was that, "I don't take the back door, I walk straight in through the front door." And I forget the rest of the quote, but he was bragging about being a real big person in Washington, D.C., basically. Okay, we also have Leopold Bialik, who is a known communist. He wanted to guarantee the privilege of mental health as a natural human right. Sound familiar? This is the 1960s, guys. 1960s. Mental health as a natural human right. And social justice, human rights activist, and he turned into a mental health professional. So he also helped with the pushing and furtherance of mental illness as a federal campaign, basically. All right, so next what's important here is that during the 60s, many people wanted to get their hand in the cookie jar of the federal government. And what also matters most is that once the federal government decided to start treating mentally ill people, the state hospitals that had been created since Dorothea Dix in the 1800s, they are like, well, wait, what's our job if the federal government's supposed to do this now? So they basically started just giving up on the whole thing as a whole, and not wanting to have to deal with it. So the first CMHC was finished in 1966. President Johnson picked up where Kennedy left off with amendments in 1965 that provided staffing grants, additional money. In 1966, when Walter Barton's article "Trends in Community Mental Health Programs" was published, the first federal grants for construction staffing of CMHCs had already been made. Barton was a visionary and a giant in the American psychiatry world in the 20th century, serving as a medical director of the American Psychiatric Association at the time of the passage of the Kennedy-Johnson legislation in the 1960s. Okay, and what I didn't mention was that his Trends in Community Mental Health Programs was published. It was proving that the theory that mental illness could be prevented was not working at all. And I've already said that it's a silly idea to believe in the first place. But now we actually had some evidence, but it was too late. Because a year later, 53 more CMHCs were finished. State hospitals realized they were not going to be getting national funds, and that's because it's very well stated in the book that Robert Felix did not like the federal government, or the local governments dealing with the mentally ill. His mission was, in fact, to destroy state-run hospitals and create the federally mandated hospital system. So state hospitals realized they were not going to get national funds from the CMHC system, and that if they did not change, there were going to be basically on the chopping block due to the wills of fiscally conservative people at the heads of state level who were wanting to save money. Okay, so now we're going to go to this section here about key NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, founders. There's obviously Robert Felix. Let me give you a little bit of background on him. He was the original founder of the NIMH. He believed serious mental illness could be caused by cultural and unclean and unhealthy society and community environments. Cited Margaret Mead, whose work was completely discredited later on when they realized that some of her key source data was from her second husband's work. His name is Rio Fortune, and his work was called The Sorcerers of Dobu, which basically he and Margaret Mead make out to be a unhealthy society. Okay. All right, going on. With the help of Jack Ewalt, William Menninger, Francis Blayland, and others, they helped develop the theory of mental. I already basically mentioned this, but it's a deeply flawed idea that today is completely discredited, even though it is still the framework, which is the underlying framework which justifies the expense of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars each year to the mental illness treatment system here in America. Okay, he expressed later on great regret that his greatest accomplishment was such a major failure. Here's a direct quote. Many of those patients who left the state hospitals never should have done so. We psychiatrists saw too much of the old snake pit, saw too many people who shouldn't have been there, and we overreacted. The result is not what we intended, and perhaps we didn't ask the questions that we should have been asking when developing a new concept. But psychiatrists are human too, and we tried our damnedest. Damnedest. I don't know if I spelled that right. Okay. And then keep in mind, though, he was still power hungry, and he wanted big things decided by psychiatrists. C. Brock Chisholm, a advocate and supporter of Robert Felix, Robert Felix quoted Chisholm in one of the most far-reaching and power-hungry comments, which was this: "We have never really had a peaceful society in the world. Can the world learn to live at peace with the other human sciences? Psychiatry must now decide what is to be the immediate future of the human race. No one else can, and this is the prime responsibility of psychiatry." Brock Chisholm was allegedly possibly a communist as well, but it never was official. He never admitted to it, so I didn't put him down there. But as you can see, what you're seeing a trend of is people, communists namely, trying to get their hands in psychiatry and take as much power as they possibly can to help guide society at large. Because that's what communists like to do. They like to think that if you're the smart guy, you're the superior, as Karl Marx wrote about, the communist man, the perfect man, the superior man. The communist man is superior to his inferiors. It's just another form of racism or fascism, whatever you want to call it. It's very radical. But that's what these people honestly believe. It hasn't changed, by the way. Anyone who's a communist today, secretly deep down, they believe that they are more intelligent for believing these doctrines. All right, so now we're going to get back to it, guys, and we're almost done. Okay, so we left off right here in 1968. Over the next 12 years, over 700 CMHCs were erected all over the country. State hospitals closed rampantly. This is, again, deinstitutionalization period where the state hospitals stopped getting money from the states and the federal government because this new system was replacing them. And the states, because of fiscally responsible leadership, said, hey, why are we spending any money on the mentally ill if the federal government's going to do it? We don't need to do this anymore. Okay? So they closed these things down. Let's see. State hospitals closed after promises of such from the CMH system continue to flow from the optimistic founders and their acolytes. Sorry, guys. I tried to write this over the last 3 months, and it's been, I rushed it. So pardon any typos you're seeing here. Okay. 1970, the people with insider knowledge of the CMHC's effectiveness realized the mental illness prevention is an idea wholly without substance or any credibility at all whatsoever. On average, 5% of persons feeling state prisons were mentally ill at this point. And I'm going to keep pointing to this because what basically happened is CMHCs during this time were found to hire expensive nice to haves to care for the wealthy, which were of no use to the seriously mentally ill persons. One example, Woodlawn, Chicago hired known communist Satanist Saul Alinsky for community planning expertise. You don't need that at a mental illness treatment system place. So that's pretty alarming, okay? That happened in 1970, okay? Board and care homes became a major problem in America during the 1970s as the state hospitals closed and the CMHCs started rejecting vast amounts of seriously mentally ill people. And seriously mentally ill basically means severe bipolar or schizophrenia. And they just didn't want to deal with it because they wanted to care for the wealthy people, basically. And so what they would do is they believed that it was their mission. They were charged with preventing mental illness. So what they'd do is take wealthy, nice people, and they'd come in and say, hey, I'm going through a divorce, or hey, I just got fired, or I'm starting a new job, and I'm stressed out. I'm getting married. I'm stressed out. You name it. And they'd be like, okay, let's talk about it. And they'd do, Jungian, Freudian type therapy, as well as prescribing drugs. So this is really the birth of the thriving pharmaceutical industry that we see today. Okay, so board and care homes were basically private citizens opening businesses to deal with the mentally insane, and they could do it anywhere. And so there's more exposés to come out later. San Jose was once described as an open-door insane asylum because of this. Basically, they had closed all of their mental institutions in the area, and they had a bunch of board and care homes really close to San Jose State University, actually. And there's a quote in here that I hopefully wrote down about how there was a billboard once that said, "You are now living in the largest experimental mental health hospital," or something like that. Anyways, there was a famous billboard in San Jose. On average, by 1980, 10% of people filling the state hospitals were mentally ill. 10%. So that's 5% increase. And whenever one of these percentage points goes up, by the way, we're talking about like 100 people. We're talking about thousands of people. Okay, thousands per state. Okay, and that's why I have to say on average here. So 1982 expose story on the 10 by 10 shack in the woods that was a board and care house with 2 mats, 1 bucket, 2 chairs, and 2 guard dogs chained up guard dogs outside, with 10 people living inside. 10 people, some of which died. Think out of sight, out of mind. I say that because that's what this whole thing was, is the CMHCs don't want to deal with the severely mentally ill, so let's basically make private citizens responsible for caring for them and pay them to do it. And these people weren't using the money correctly. They were using it to go live lavish lifestyles. And this is still going on to this day, which is mentioned in the book. So as in detail as I am going into right now, the book is still way more thorough, and I really enjoyed this book. I'll get back to that later. All right, 89. SFTV show puts up flyers around it's San Francisco. Flyers around the city to promote a program on mental illness. It read, "You are now walking through America's newest mental institution." Yeah, the streets of San Francisco. 89, guys. 89. This is not a new matter, almost approaching 50 years later. At least 40, almost 40 years later. It hasn't changed. It's only gotten worse, really. 1990s. Final stages of deinstitutionalization. 15% of persons filling state hospitals are now mentally ill. And this is a whole point in the book. They go into great detail talking about how now police and criminal justice system is now in charge of the severely mentally ill. 2000s. Psychosis as normal movements. Groups have stated that advocate that the mentally ill are simply living alternative lifestyles. This is the insanity of modern, social justice crap. Psychics Anonymous. I'm sorry, I think I misspelled this. This must be Psychotics Anonymous. Yeah, I think it must have been Psychotics Anonymous groups have sprung up to replace the once common group meetings that would be ordinary and mandatory at the state hospital level, which was normal to basically talk with your psychologist and see how you're doing, let the psychologist check in with all of you, what's new, and share stuff so you guys can kind of learn and grow, which had real benefits, by the way, but I don't have time to mention all that. Statistics continue to worsen, proving that the emptying of the state hospitals paired with CMHCs and the board and care homes that simply do not want the hard to care for or severely mentally ill patients create dangerous urban centers that are incapable of dealing with their mentally ill as the problem that requires more attention by the police, basically. Okay, so now I can skip ahead to today. There are 12.3 million people with paranoid schizophrenia, bipolar, or manic depression in the United States. 20 to 40% of persons filling state hospitals are mentally ill. 20 to 40%. Across the states, an average of 1/3 of the jail inmates are mentally ill and consume the vast majority of prison's budget for medicine and drugs. Other states have been between 40 and 66% of inmates are mentally ill. Southern states have even more, I remember. Articles of what happened in recent past, what happened to the mental, let's see what the source is. It's this Psychiatry Online, some random article. Don't have time to show it to you, but this entire document is actually on my cloud, and I'm going to see if I can share it with you guys in the comment notes if you guys want to look at this. Again, this is eDraw Mastermind software. It's really cool for brainstorming. Okay, ongoing repercussions. Police all over America now agree that the current armed and untrained problems are untrained handling of the mentally ill, and that prisons now have around 1/3 of the inmates being mentally ill. And we have cities like San Francisco, Seattle, LA, and Portland that basically just don't even punish these laws. Like, they don't enforce anti-loitering laws or doing public indecency, urinating, defecating, you name it. Like, none of the laws are actually enforced anymore. They don't even do a slap on the wrist, because if they did, it would mean the police have to busy themselves a lot more than they already do with the mentally ill. Additional thoughts. To date, the U.S. still has no national database for tracking states on the mentally ill. All data from this book takes its data from the state records. No national records are kept on this matter. Today, the industry seems to be living by this rule. Do not ask questions to which you do not want to know the answer. Out of sight, out of mind mentality. Possible solutions. Here's some that are given by the book. ACT teams. People available 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year to help the mental illness persons with all kinds of things. If they are arrested, if they are having a panic attack, you name it, these people are ready to meet them or be on the phone with them. This is something that has been tried in 1 or 2 states. Now, something that I didn't even have time to mention is that the mentally ill often have something called anosognosia. Anosognosia is a condition when you cannot tell that you are mentally ill, that is something wrong with you and your brain, and that you are in fact different from everyone around you in your society or community. Anosognosia is the reason why deinstitutionalization was a disaster. Letting these people out of the prisons and being like, hey, we've got a drug to give you, just take it, keep taking it, and you'll be fine. Guess what? If they've got anosognosia, they're not going to keep taking it. Why should they take a drug if they're normal, if they're fine? They don't need it. They can't tell that they're different because they're the part of the brain that helps them compare themselves and judge themselves versus the society at large around them isn't working properly. All right, next we've got clubhouses, strong support networks that help people provide actual training, job training, and that means employment beyond checking on patients' medication consumption and mental well-being. Those with anosognosia are unlikely to comply or participate willingly, and that is the same with ACT teams. Those with anosognosia do not cooperate. And something I didn't mention in the notes is that the problem is that again, I'm a libertarian, but there are some drawbacks to being truly libertarian in all ways. And the thing is, libertarian lawyers through the 1960s won a number of court cases that said basically, unless you are a obvious threat to yourself or others, you do not have a right to incarcerate people against their will. You just don't have a right to have them forcibly committed to hospitals. And so because the libertarians won these court cases, we still to this day don't have a lot of tools for dealing with people with anosognosia. Reopening state hospitals state-ran hospitals. Oh, okay, there's another possible solution. Sorry. I'm jumping around as fast as I can to make this shorter. I don't know if it's working. But basically, stop spending money on the community mental health treatment system and reopening state-run hospitals, and stop spending SSI and SSDI on the mentally ill. Return accountability to states, even on the county level. Reduce federal costs and return some power to the local governments. Give all funding and power to the state. It is the last option. Give all funding to the states. The criminal justice system, basically. Give all of the power and funding to the criminal justice system to deal with the insane, because that's who's dealing with it right now. Police, mostly. Police have to arrest these people on the street and take them to prisons or wherever they're going to be held for a short amount of time, and then they're released. And then, maybe they go in through the system a few times, and then the police just stop prosecuting them. They give up on them. And then those people later murder people a lot of the time. That's just what examples were given in the book. And many examples were given in the book. Okay? All right. Not likely to help those with slight problems, but would definitely improve the situation for those with more severe illnesses. Okay? All right. Failed solutions that have been tried. Making mental illness treatment a for-profit industry. Smart businesses maximize profits before maximizing their care and products. It's been tried. This is the board and care system that I talked about. Reducing costs means only accepting the easy patients and avoiding all the hard to care for patients. Saw that as well. In the name of reducing costs for profitable businesses, we release the expensive patients to save money with disastrously and predictable outcomes for society at large. And $1 Million Murray case, this man, Murray Barr, is one of many examples you can look at where a single individual who's mentally ill cost a state over $1 million in 1 year. 1 fucking year. Okay? So he's a famous case because he cost a state over $1 million in 1 year with all the, incarcerating him, dealing with him, all the legal lawyers representing him, yada, yada, yada. All right, having zero accountability between state. This is another failed solution. Zero accountability between state, federal, and other institutions and programs by making it all confusing like it currently is. There's no accountability, guys. No accountability. If something goes wrong, you just play the blame game and say, "Oh, that guy was doing it wrong." Just that one little individual at the board and care home, or the president at that particular CMHC was doing it wrong. But there's no state level or federal level president that's like they take responsibility for it. It's just basically anarchical. There's very little order to this, guys. Okay, so that's basically all my notes, guys. I think I did it in less than an hour. It's so long, so pardon the length. But basically, guys, what I've learned from this though is how we've gotten to where we are now, and what needs to be done to get us out of this hole. And I think with your help, funding my Kickstarter campaign, I can basically do a small expose on this, but talk about the greater implications of where we are today, why, and how we can get out of it. Even though there are some huge barriers to changing the system, what I do know is that there has been some great information coming out to the public. Recently, I volunteered for Emily Zhao, a mayor candidate here in San Francisco, and she did a crazy expose on the fact that the city is doing the same exact style of work because this on the city level, the city is being given on average right now. Last year, 1.4 billion. This year, 2019, 2.4 billion already. That number is probably already changed. And guess what? The amount actually being spent on the mentally ill, which is what this money is being sent for cleaning up the city and dealing with the mentally ill people, I honestly suppose maybe 100 million or maybe as much as 500 million is being spent each year between over 600 different nonprofits and profit institutionalization. I'm sorry, I'm not even making sense. This is like word salad now. Basically, the city is dividing all the money they get and spending maybe 500 million. But I highly doubt it. I've lived on these streets. I've seen what they do, and I think maybe 100 million, or maybe 2 to 500 million at most. But they're being paid 2.4 billion. So this is major corruption. There's major corruption in the city, guys. Politicians and people leading these nonprofit organizations, they're taking insane checks home to the bank, and they're living lavish lifestyles here in San Francisco because they're taking the taxpayer money and they're taking the money from the giant corporations like Google, Facebook, and all the ones that are basically throwing donations to the city to try to help the city. And the city's fucking it up because they're evil and corrupt. And basically, I mean, I'll tell you right now, I'll spoil it because most people that see my Kickstarter campaign won't see this video. I'll tell you right now, one of the major conclusions I know that I'm going to be drafting in the documentary, if I can get the funding for it, is that in our lifetime, I highly suspect that for the first time since 1964, a Republican will actually win a seat as mayor in San Francisco before I die, basically. I'm not saying it's going to happen very, very soon, but I think it's going to happen. I mean, Ellen Lee Zhao activated the Chinese population here in San Francisco, and she got 15% of the vote, okay? London Breed won with about 60% of the vote, okay? So that's a lot. It's a big difference, but still, I mean, that means something, I think. And Ellen Lee Zhao had a terrible campaign. I tried volunteering some marketing expertise, but she's very Chinese and basically just didn't listen to anything I said. So I will be interviewing her. I'm close with her, and I'll be interviewing her in the documentary because of what she's been able to do an expose on, and I'll be looking into her sources and all that good stuff. So anyways, guys, I forgot to mention these other guys. I'm going to mention them real quick. These are other leaders within the National Institute of Mental Health. You got Stanley F. Yoles, who in 1965 said, the psychiatrist is aware that a man's mind assaulted by poverty is either... I'm sorry, I don't know what I wrote. I've written this stuff so long ago, honestly. I've been writing these notes for months. Acute or chronic form. Poverty is either in its acute or chronic form is susceptible to mental disturbance, disorder, and disease. The conditions of poverty, since they constitute a breeding ground for mental illness, require the professional involvement of the modern psychiatrist, working with community leaders. You see how this is so communist? Community leaders, like a community leader would know how to help somebody. Like, you're not a professional at dealing with mental illness just because you're a community leader. This is all communist ideology, guys. It really is. And that means it's flawed. Because a community leader doesn't know anything. Yeah, community leaders and specialists in other professions. We, as specialists in the art of psychiatry, have skills and knowledge which can help the statesman, the politician, and the poor man himself to intervene in the condition of the poverty before it creeps into the fiber of a man's thoughts and behavior. So as you can see, he really believed in this stuff, guys. He openly proclaimed he hated the state-run mental hospitals and spoke poorly of them often. and he is NIMH director from 64 to 70. And then next was Bertram S. Brown. And Bertram S. Brown was maybe a little bit better, but also a staunch communist-sounding person. Anyways, guys, that's a wrap for this book, American Psychosis. I highly suggest you read it yourself if you're interested in the subject matter. What is next up on the block of books on this matter is reading. I already have it, and I've already read the first 3 chapters. It's called Death of the Asylum by John A. Talbot. He is the most reputable guy you could possibly read from, because he was the president of the American Psychiatric Association himself as well, and he actually ran his own state hospital, not a CMHC, but a state hospital. So really impressive academic and professional. And a quote from him was, "The psychiatrists involved in the policy making at the time certainly oversold community treatment, and our credibility today is probably damaged because of it." He says the politics were based partially on wishful thinking, partially on the enormousness of the problem and the lack of a silver bullet to resolve it, that then as now. So basically, as you can see, he understood from the beginning that the whole system that was created just didn't work, and the Death of the Asylum is basically more of a historical record of how the state hospitals failed and why. And so far, it's been really historical based, really interesting though, in talking about how most of these mental hospitals got into disarray because they lacked funding and they didn't have enough money for personnel. So a single individual often was in charge of like way too many people, like one staff worker for like 20 people or something, and it's insane. It's unmanageable. Anyways, guys, that's a wrap. Yeah, I hope you liked this video. I hope you learned something. I think there's a lot of good information here on the whole story, and thanks for watching again. Please, guys, I do this stuff out of the goodness of my heart and nothing else. If you can donate anything or become a patron of mine, I have this awesome deal that I'll tell you about right now. Hey, do you like this kind of content? If you do, please consider supporting me on Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can join my online community. Every Thursday night, we get together on my private Discord server, and we talk politics, news, and most importantly, how to create the change we want to see in politics and our society in a civil manner. If you don't already know any conservatives in your area, maybe a little bit like me, because, well, I live behind enemy lines in the Socialist Republic of California, then you might want to look for some friends to talk to about these ideas that you have swimming in your head. So it's really a great community that I'm just building right now. So even though my community here on YouTube isn't very big, it really doesn't matter how large the followership is, but how active the individuals are when it comes to creating real change, which is why I made this channel. It has nothing to do with profiting necessarily. It has everything to do with creating the change that I want to see in the world and in this country. So if you'd like to create this kind of change, please consider spending $120 over the next 12 months, starting in November 2019 to November 2020, the next election year, on your favorite content producers that are conservative, because, well, we need a little help. We don't have the infrastructure that CNN, MSNBC, and you name it has. See, they get money from Daddy Warbucks, George Soros, so they don't really need to be catering to any particular audience. They can just sell the propaganda that they need to sell, and they get paid, no matter who's watching, and whether they like it or not. So if you like this, please, please, please consider investing in not just my future, but yours. Thanks for watching, guys. Have a good one.